I think people are still coming on, but I'll make a few introductory remarks and welcome some of the co-sponsors as people are joining us so they won't miss the program. For those of you who are already on, welcome. My name is Jeremy Burton. I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Boston. I want to thank tonight's co-sponsors for this program, the Western Avenue Baptist Church in Cambridge, Facing History and Ourselves, ADL New England, AJC New England, the Jewish Alliance for Law and Social Action, and Keshet. Before we begin our program and have our distinguished panel, I just want to take a moment to step back and say, why is JCRC sponsoring tonight's program? And I guess it should be obvious that there's been a continued increase in violent rhetoric, extremist activity, bias incidents, and hate crimes. And certainly all of us here were shocked last week when we saw that the FBI foiled an attempted kidnapping of the Michigan governor by far-right extremists. It's not the only incident in recent years. Over the last several years, we've seen groups like the Proud Boys, who've recently been in the news, amping up their rhetoric and becoming more emboldened and organized. There's a real danger that these groups are growing and becoming more mainstreamed and normalized. As Jews, we know all too well what happens when hatred and bigotry go unchecked. And as we grapple with our country's history of anti-Semitism and racism, we must do what we can to lift up the important work of groups like Integrity for America, who we're delighted to hear from tonight, as they take on these radical groups. And I will add as well, because we've been having a series of programs here at JCRC with our partners in Boston, one of our key focus areas has been on preserving democracy, something we've talked about recently in other spaces. And we believe that violent right-wing extremists and white supremacists undermine the security of our democracy by distorting the public debate and driving deeper wedges into our society. So it's a real pleasure for us tonight to welcome our friends from Integrity for America and to learn more about this effort to combat right-wing extremism and those who foster it and support it and organize it. Before we begin our program, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our panel. Particularly proud to introduce a partner of the JCRC, Pastor Jeremy Battle, the senior pastor of Western Avenue Baptist Church here in Cambridge, which is where I live, who, in addition to his amazing bio, he's a third-generation pastor from Brighton, Alabama. He completed his undergraduate studies at Stanford and at Morehouse and has a Master's of Divinity from Harvard Divinity School, where he currently serves as an instructor and field educator. And he has he has completed a Doctor of Ministry at Candler College of Theology at Emory University. He's been serving as the pastor of Western Avenue Baptist since 2011, and he tells us that his greatest joys are his wife and children. And for us at JCRC, our joy is that he has been a partner with us and is an alumnus of our Israel study tours and was with us in Israel and the Palestinian areas. I believe it was summer of 2018. And suffice to say, we are all looking forward to when we renew our travel programs again someday. Amy Spatalic is the Executive Director of Integrity First for America, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization dedicated to holding those accountable who threaten long-standing principles of our democracy, including our country's commitment to civil rights and equal justice. IFA is backing the landmark federal lawsuit filed by a coalition of Charlottesville community members against the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for the August 2017 violence. Amy has an extensive experience in government politics and advocacy, including work with the New York State Attorney General, with the New York City Mayor's Office, and as Communications Director in the New York Senate. She has worked on a number of federal, state, and local campaigns and advocacies groups. And finally, Michael Block is counsel at Kaplan, Hecker, and Fink. He is an experienced trial attorney who spent over 7 years as a public defender at the Bronx Defenders and 3 years as a litigation associate at Williams and Connolly before joining Kaplan and Hecker. Mike is currently partnering with Integrity First for America as one of the leaders on the legal team on the Charlottesville litigation and continuing a theme of connections to Boston. By the way, Amy is a former, is a Hill president, I think, at Tufts. Michael graduated from Harvard Law School, where he represented clients charged with crimes in the Roxbury District Court as part of the Criminal Justice Institute. And he worked with the NAACP representing a client in post-conviction proceedings as part of the death penalty clinic. He has served as a law clerk to Honorable Chief Judge Helen Ginger Berrigan of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Louisiana, and subsequently to the Honorable Diane Wood on the U.S. Court of Appeals for 7th Circuit. We're very delighted to have this amazing panel with us tonight, and we're proud to partner with our members and other organizations here in Boston to bring this program to our community so we can learn more about the litigation and how we can support the campaign to defeat white supremacy and its backers in the United States. And now I'm going to turn it over to Amy, who's going to show us a brief video before we begin tonight's program. Amy.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. And it is a pleasure to be back, at least virtually, in Boston. I think probably speaking on behalf of both Mike and myself, we wish we could be there in person, especially for this event in the Boston community. But well, this is the next best thing, and hopefully we will return in person when our trial is over and when it is safe to do so in terms of COVID. But before I pass it back to Pastor Battle to begin our discussion, I'm going to share my screen and show a brief video that takes us back to 2017 and serves as a reminder of what happened 3 years ago.
Stark displays of racism. Trying to promote my car has rammed into a crowd. They've been thrown in the air. React to domestic terror. Others children. 10 of the people who were injured in Charlottesville, including 3 of the people who were hit by that car and survived, have now brought a lawsuit against not only the murderer who drove his vehicle into the crowd, but also the leaders of all of the white nationalist groups that organized and promoted the Charlottesville event.
We are Integrity First for America. We are here to disrupt the extremism, to interrupt the cycle, to dismantle and bankrupt these hate groups and their leaders, to put them out of business, and most importantly, to stop violence. Integrity First for America is leading the fight against white supremacy. Our Charlottesville lawsuit is the only current legal effort taking on the broad leadership of this movement, holding white supremacists accountable for their premeditated violence. We know that it's working. They're already facing huge financial and legal consequences, but we also know what we're up against. Bankrupting Nazis isn't cheap. These groups are still recruiting, weaponizing fear, and preparing for their next attack. Now more than ever, we are reminded of our obligation to dismantle the systems of white supremacy that poison this country. Turn your outrage into action, because hate has no place here.
Again, family, we want to welcome you, each of you friends, colleagues, folks who are allied with us. We see each of you here. We want to welcome you once again for engaging in this difficult but needed conversation around how members of our community across the country, particularly IFA in this case, and our dear friends who are joining with us, Michael, are taking under this significant work to literally take white supremacy to court. It's an interesting idea that is most certainly understood from my hometown. I am a child of what we call the post-civil rights Birmingham, Alabama. And it is strange that in 2017 and to now, we're having conversations around white national terrorism. That reminds me deeply of 16th Street Baptist Church and all the things that we saw and my parents' parents and a host of churches and families, and even in recent days, in recent years, in churches across the country where we have seen this upheaval of racial violence. And the question is, you know, what are we to do in this time? And we have friends, colleagues who at least are joining us today who have taken a very specific approach to taking on white supremacy through civil litigation, which is a really interesting and significant approach to trying to debunk and dismantle racism. And so I have Amy and Michael here, and we're going to invite them to dive in and dig deeper with us. I will say this, that as an African-American male in today's time, we are often wondering, most of us, all of us, across racial, religious lines, to what degree is any effort helpful and will make a significant difference in the lives of our day-to-day lives. There's so many folks who are occupied with so many things in corporations and in their work-life balance today. And obviously, with the pandemic happening and with the upheaval of police brutality, all sorts of things that are happening in our neighborhoods, many of us are asking significant questions, not only with respect to the election and the presidential politics, the stuff that we're seeing, the rancor, the vitriol, and what seems to be adding fuel to fire to seasons that we would have believed would be over. There are conversations that we're having today around race and relations in the country, where many of us are saying to ourselves, are we really living in the 60s? Are we really living in a time that should have been past? And so people are often asking the questions, like I am, like what do we do, and what difference can we make in seasons like these? And I believe you all have been trying to at least discuss and to discover what efforts should look like in seasons like these. And so I would like you all to take us, if you will, back to 2017, both Amy and Michael, and give us a sense of your personal commitment to this movement, to this very specific effort that you all are launching to in essence, dismantle types of systematic racism that we're seeing in our country.
Thank you so much, Pastor Battle. I think you're exactly right, that it is so horrifying and yet accurate to look at some of the images, some of the events of the last few years and feel like we've been transported back in time. That something like this, many of us never expected to see happen again in an American city and American streets, and yet it has. And it's worth remembering the details of what happened in Charlottesville before we dive into this conversation, not just for the purposes of discussing our case, but also because what happened in Charlottesville really served as a harbinger or a preview of the violence and the tactics that have followed. And so first, I think many of us vividly remember watching images of that Tiki torch march on Friday, August 11th. This was intended to be a surprise, whereas the Unite the Right rally the next day was planned and publicized. The Tiki torch march was planned, but it was intentionally kept secret. These neo-Nazis and white supremacists wearing matching uniforms, carrying matching Tiki torches, descended on the University of Virginia, marching down through campus, and ultimately surrounded a small group of peaceful counter-protesters who had gathered at the Thomas Jefferson statue. These extremists chanted things like "Jews will not replace us," "Blood and soil," "White lives matter." They surrounded those counter-protesters, throwing fuel and lit torches, beating them up, kicking them, punching them. One of our plaintiffs, who was an African-American undergrad at the University of Virginia, said he thought he was going to die that night. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, an interfaith gathering had to shelter in place. Ironically, our plaintiff, Reverend Wisboy, and some others had brought together the faith community in Charlottesville to give them a safe space to come together, knowing that white supremacists were descending on their town. And the irony is that during this Tiki torch march, they had to shelter in place because of the violence that was happening just outside. The next day, Saturday, August 10th, I think many of us remember how the day ended when the car attack that killed Heather Heyer and injured many of our plaintiffs. But it's important to understand that that was really the culmination of a day of violence. Instead of marching on the University of Virginia, this time these neo-Nazis and white supremacists marched on downtown Charlottesville. They were there under the guise of protesting the removal of the Robert E. Lee Confederate statue. But as we'll describe, that's not actually what they were there to do. They were there to wreak havoc and cause violence and target people based on their race, religion, and willingness to defend the rights of others. Among other things, they surrounded the local synagogue, which was observing Shabbat services on a Saturday morning. The synagogue had to evacuate both congregants and Torah scrolls out the back, and the detail that gets me every single time, no matter how often I read it in our lawsuit, is that the synagogue was home to a Torah scroll that was saved from Nazi Germany decades ago. And here in America in 2017, it was once again under Nazi threat. And that is just a heartbreaking reminder of the point you were making, Pastor, of the sort of the horrifying nature of where we are. The violence continued throughout the day. They stormed a line of peaceful clergy, including our plaintiff, Reverend Whistleway, who were marching. And ultimately, we know how the day culminated in James Fields driving his car into a crowd of peaceful counter-protesters, killing Heather Heyer, injuring many others, including a number of our plaintiffs. And what's so important to understand is that nothing that happened was an accident, but as Mike will describe, was planned for months in advance on social media, down to discussions of hitting protesters with cars. And it's those chats and that communication that really serve as the basis of our case.
I would add, I think what Amy described is absolutely accurate in terms of, what you saw on the surface of what the community of Charlottesville experienced and the trauma that they went through from everything that happened the weekend of August 11th and 12th. I think what the suit hopefully will illuminate more at trial is exactly what Amy touched on at the end, which is that it was absolutely no accident. It was the rally was meticulously planned on a number of different social media platforms and email accounts and cell phones, et cetera. The primary platform was a social media gaming platform called Discord, which is primarily intended for folks to communicate while they're playing video games. The defendants in our suit designed a server, an invite-only server, which they used to plan every detail of what happened that weekend. They talked about fighting tactics. They talked about meticulous sort of research and discussion about Virginia laws and how to sort of disguise what they had planned to do as self-defense or as free speech. They talked about how to use things like flags and signs that were kind of ostensibly brought, to carry a message and to convey a, First Amendment protected ideas, but how to use things like that as weapons and to sort of fortify them in such a way that they would really sort of plant the seeds for a self-defense defense and a First Amendment defense, but be able to use the things they brought actually as weapons. And as Amy mentioned, they talked about whether it was legal to run over counter-protesters in the state of Virginia. So all of it was meticulously planned, intentional, and the basis of our suit is that what actually happened was a conspiracy to commit racially motivated violence, which is what they did.
Amy and Michael, do you mind talking to us, for us non-legal experts? I happen to live with a lawyer and my wife, but as a non-legal person here, help us understand how you all are approaching this. I mean, there are several ways that you and I talked about cases like these being prosecuted at the criminal level, federal level, with the Attorney General of the United States, of America, and there's a very specific reason why you all are taking this very specific approach to try to litigate in this particular fashion. Can you speak to us more about why this alternative, especially in light of the fact that we haven't seen much prosecution, at least at the federal level, at the criminal level?
I'll start and then Mike, I'll pass it to Mike if that works. I think you're right. Look, the facts back up what you just suggested, which is that this Department of Justice and its Civil Rights Division, which would normally be sort of front and center on issues like what happened in Charlottesville, have instead been disinvesting from civil rights cases, most notably the DOJ Civil Rights Division's investigations and prosecutions are down nearly 2/3 compared to 3 or 4 years ago. And while there have been a handful of individual prosecutions against some of the individuals involved in the Charlottesville violence, the leaders, the broad 24 or so individuals and groups responsible for orchestrating the violence have not faced accountability. And so that's what our suit is about. And it's all the more critical at a moment where there is not a federal partner taking on what the federal government might normally do in a moment like this. And so instead, private plaintiffs like ours, using statutes like the one we are using, the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, which I'm confident Mike will describe in a moment, it makes cases like this all the more crucial. And so Mike, if you want to maybe describe the legal theory itself.
Sure. Yeah, so as private litigants, we don't have the authority to prosecute, only the law enforcement authorities do, but what we do have the ability to do because of federal statutes like the Ku Klux Klan Act is to bring suit on behalf of private plaintiffs for the injuries that they suffered, for compensation for the various injuries. And so in this case, we brought suit under, as Amy mentioned, what's called the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. And that was a statute passed by the Reconstructionist Congress after the Civil War, when, I guess somewhat ironically, the Klan was wreaking havoc and there wasn't much being done about it. And so what the Congress wanted to do was to give force to the recently enacted amendments, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendment, to give private plaintiffs the ability to bring actions in federal court. And so what this particular statute allows is anybody who is a victim of as we have in this case, a conspiracy, which is really just a legal term for an agreement, a conspiracy to commit racially motivated violence. If you are the victim of such an action, you can bring suit against the perpetrators of that action in federal court. And so what we need to prove in this case is that there was such a conspiracy, that is an agreement amongst the defendants that we have sued. There are about 24 defendants. And the suit alleges that over the course of the months leading up to the Unite the Right event, they agreed amongst each other to commit violence and to do so with racial animus, intending to commit racially motivated violence against counter-protesters. So that's the legal theory of the case, and that's what we think the evidence supports.
In terms of details that you can share or not share, where are you all with the case? And what are some of the roadblocks ahead? And yeah, if you could just kind of give us an update of sort of where you all are hoping to go with the case and where you are with the case, even prior to it coming before the court, I think is, I understand, in April, correct?
Correct. So we filed suit in October. In fact, 3 years ago yesterday, we filed suit in federal court in Charlottesville. And for the overwhelming majority of that time, really until the end of July this summer, we were in what's known in civil litigation as discovery, which is the process of gathering information from the other side. That begins with a request from us for documents, which is a standard request in civil litigation, that the defendants turn over all of documents in their possession, including electronic documents in their cell phones and their email accounts, et cetera, that were used to plan the rally. And we spent nearly 2.5 years litigating issues related to discovery. And that's because, generally speaking, the defendants refused to comply with our requests, with court orders that were intended to enforce our requests, and also committed wholesale acts of evidence destruction, essentially. There were cell phones that, as soon as we issued our request, there were cell phones that fell in toilets that, quote unquote, exploded. We've heard sort of any number of excuses for why all of a sudden electronic evidence disappeared rapidly as soon as we issued our document requests. And so we spent a lot of time in court requesting orders that certain defendants comply with discovery, and ultimately asking for sanctions against certain defendants who wouldn't comply, which were ordered, or which were issued against a number of defendants, some for substantial fees in penalties. One defendant in particular was actually incarcerated for a period of time for failing to comply with his obligations in this case. And once we sort of fought through that challenging, to say the least, aspect of the case, we then took depositions of each of the defendants and certain other witnesses, all of which wrapped up in July. You're correct, Pastor Battle. We actually had a trial date of October 26th, which relatively recently was moved because of COVID to April 26th of 2021. And so we are now in the process of basically gathering and reviewing everything that we collected through discovery and preparing for trial.
And if I can jump in for a second, I think it's worth putting a fine point on some of the points Mike made, which is that even before we get to trial, we have seen very real financial, legal, and operational impacts on the defendants, which is important. And in the chat, folks can click on a link to read about those in more detail. But among those impacts, Mike talked about over $41,000 in sanctions against some of the defendants. 2 had bench warrants issued for their arrest, one very recently, who we expect to be incarcerated soon, hopefully, and another who, as Mike mentioned, was incarcerated for some time earlier this year. Other defendants have complained about the case's impact, like Richard Spencer, who called this case, quote, financially crippling, or Defendant League of the South, which is a neo-Confederate hate group, talking about how they can't open a new building because of our case. Others have claimed that they're leaving the white supremacist movement as a result of our case, and whether or not they are credible is certainly up in the air, and many experts have thoughts about that. But the point being that certainly they're all feeling the pressure here. And then when we go to trial and win large civil judgments against these defendants, it will have an impact that is infinitely greater, effectively allowing us to bankrupt and dismantle these groups and these leaders in a way that no other litigation in the country is doing right now.
Well, first of all, yeah, we want to, obviously from Western Avenue Baptist Church, and for those who are joining, we've got folks across the country who are joining with us. We want to thank you all for doing this important work. One of the things that has been abundantly clear to me throughout history is that there have been so many partnerships key. Our Jewish brothers and sisters, organizations like yours, over the years that have allowed us to do such great work. I mean, you go back to the civil rights movement, you think about Abraham and Joshua Heschel, you think about all of these folks who really came together across faiths, across communities to do this important work. And they all had a personal invested conviction to helping carry the cause of justice forward. And if you all don't mind, can you all give us, I mean, both of your resumes are incredible in terms of your experiences and your commitments to the work of justice. And I would love for you all to speak to us about your personal connection and conviction to this particular moment right now, this particular work that you're under now.
I think it's impossible to do this work without being personally motivated. I'm sure that's very true of your work too, Pastor Battle, and of most folks tuning in. It's deeply personal for the whole team for a variety of reasons. For me, I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and I think a lot about that aspect of my family history and what my grandparents miraculously survived. They were the only ones of their family to survive. My grandmother, hid under a porch as her sisters and nieces and nephews were murdered by the Nazis. And it's those stories that were sort of seared into my brain when I was a kid growing up as this thing that was far off and could never, ever happen here. And I'm not suggesting that we are there, that we are in the 30s or 40s, but it is important to understand some of the signs and some of the parallels, and the fact that neo-Nazis are so emboldened that they can do what they did in Charlottesville and do what they've done since in terms of the broader cycle of violence, which so many of our defendants are connected to, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And it's easy to feel scared and hopeless and frustrated in a moment like this, when all of this is happening in our country, a place that was supposed to be safe for us, for my family, and for so many others. But here's the difference. Unlike my grandparents' generation, we live in a country that is governed by a rule of law, that has a justice system, that has laws like the KKK Act. And while we certainly, and today probably put a fine point on it, need to fight like crazy to protect that justice system and protect that rule of law, we have it still. And we will use it as much as we possibly can to hold those accountable who threaten it, who threaten our civil rights. And that's exactly what our work at IFA is about. That's exactly what this case is about. And so while it is so easy to feel frightened in this particular moment in history, it also provides some grounding, and I think for me, some optimism about the tools that we have to fight back and how we can utilize them to do so.
And I would say, thanks for the question, Pastor Battle. I would say a number of things. I also am the grandchild of Holocaust survivors. My grandfather escaped Nazi Germany and actually came to this country and then went back to Germany to fight for the Americans, which I always thought was just an incredible act of courage. I was raised by two lawyers who were very mindful of using law degrees sort of to advance the rule of law and cause of social justice. My mother clerked for Thurgood Marshall and sort of has devoted her career to teaching constitutional law and the rule of law and social justice. And so I went to law school really with that in mind. I spent 7 years prior to this work as a public defender in the Bronx, which was just the most rewarding work I've ever done until now. And I think there's some parallels, I would say. I mean, I think I spent a great deal of time as a public defender, obviously representing individuals that were charged with crimes and needed help, but I think more broadly, people that were victims of structural racism. And so for me, the opportunity to take on, people that are kind of the face of violent white supremacy in America was something that was incredibly meaningful to me. I would note that I think this case is important, and I think to be able to, I think these particular defendants are really the face of kind of the most explicit violent white supremacy in America. But I also think it's important to note that they are not all of what white supremacy means in this country by any means. And I think that there is also deep-seated structural racism that exists in our policies and in our institutions like police departments. And I think there's obviously lots of work being done by lots of people on those fronts, and lots more that needs to be done. I think this is a portion of that, in that, as you noted, these defendants have mainstreamed explicit violent hatred, and that's a real problem on so many levels, but it's by no means the extent of the problem.
Can you speak more directly about the defendants, what's motivating them, and what you all are specifically with respect to the face of this group? Because I mean, for all of us watching, and for all of us, you think about Michigan, you think about all these places around the country that are experiencing, to be honest with you, what seems to be the tactic of Ku Klux Klansmen, right? To cover their faces, to hide their faces. How are you all specifically attacking the specific group in this particular case? And can you talk to us a little bit more about the defendant, if you don't mind?
Sure. Go ahead, Amy.
I'll start and then I'll pass. I think, Pastor Val, going back to something you said earlier, it's when you asked what motivates them, it's so important to understand that they hate all of us. Like everyone on this call, we are probably part of one of the groups that is central to their hateful ideology. And they are motivated by a number of far-right conspiracies, most notably something known as the Great Replacement, which is the idea that Jews are the puppet masters orchestrating the replacement of the white race. And that's why they chant things like Jews will not replace us. That's why, for example, the Pittsburgh shooter, we're coming up on the 2-year anniversary of that horrific attack, targeted a synagogue that worked with the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, supporting refugees of all backgrounds. That's why the same motivation that we saw in so many other racist, Islamophobic, xenophobic, and anti-Semitic attacks in recent years. And so their own ideology underscores just how deeply all of our faiths are intertwined here, and that we can't combat one form of hate and one form of extremism without combating them all, because they're all inherent to the violent white supremacy this case takes on, and that our defendants really are the face of. I will let Mike describe who the defendants are, but I will just add one more quick point, which is that we know that the defendants are not only responsible for what happened in Charlottesville 3 years ago, but are deeply connected to the broader cycle of extremist violence, whether it's communicating with the Pittsburgh shooter before his attack on right-wing hate site Gab, or for example, the Christchurch shooter who killed dozens of Muslims praying in mosque last year, painted onto his gun a white power symbol that was popularized by one of our defendants. And that attack in turn inspired Poway and El Paso. And even now during the Black Lives Matter protests and the COVID pandemic, we see our defendants continuing to crop up in terms of whether it's an attempt to bomb a hospital in Missouri in March, or spreading disinformation online about violence by Antifa, or any of these other attempts by the defendants to spread disinformation, terror, and violence. They are very squarely in the center of this violent movement, and all that does is affirm the importance of taking them on directly and holding them accountable in court, which has the ability to both bankrupt and dismantle them with impacts that'll go well beyond Charlottesville. So Mike, sorry, I interrupted you before. I will pass it back to you to describe who these people are.
No problem. Yeah, I mean, in terms of specifically who they are the leaders of the white supremacist movement in America today. And so, what does that mean? And I think you raise a really good, important point, which is, what is their relationship to like the Klan and the sort of more characteristic types of white supremacy that we've seen throughout our history. And the answer is that they are really kind of an outgrowth of this movement, the white supremacist movement that began really in earnest after the Civil War. And that movement really built a culture of language and tactics and messaging, a lot of which centered around, obviously, racism and anti-Semitism, but also violence. And so, we have experts in this case that have opined that these particular defendants are really just kind of, like I said, an outgrowth of that deep-seated culture that goes back 150 years. And what is kind of particularly, I think, concerning is, whereas Klansmen used to wear hoods and meet in the forest, today's white supremacist doesn't feel the need to do that because they have been yearning for a day when their rhetoric and tactics were more mainstream. And they believe, probably with some justification, that day has arrived. And so they are more polished than your kind of characteristic white supremacists that we see, in the 20s and in the 60s. And they don't wear hoods and they don't wear masks, but they believe in the same the same form of racism and anti-Semitism with the same intensity. They have the same goals. They what they call themselves, they won't call themselves white supremacists. They call themselves white nationalists, and what that means is that they explicitly strive for a country of white people. They call it a white ethno-state, and that they will essentially try to achieve that by any means necessary. And so specifically, who are they? Some of them are household names. Richard Spencer, kind of the most prominent, Jason Kessler, Chris Cantwell. Chris Cantwell is featured in a Vice documentary. He's been referred to as the crying Nazi. Matthew Heimbach, and then some groups that the entities that they come from: Vanguard America, Identity Europa, League of the South. Many of these groups are really just kind of 21st century versions of white supremacists that we've seen sort of stemming out of the Civil War, and so that have kind of wreaked havoc throughout our history.
And one particular flag, in light of some of the news over the last few weeks, both, I think it's worth noting that the lead defendant in our case, the Kessler and Sines v. Kessler, was actually a Proud Boy at the time of the Charlottesville violence. And to that point, when they were told to stand back and stand by during the debate a few weeks ago, we saw the impact of a comment like that firsthand, and how it essentially motivates these extremists to action. And among other things, Andrew England, who is one of our defendants and who writes the Daily Stormer, which is, I think, the world's most trafficked hate site, or something along those lines, posted the morning after the debate about how the president's comments were a call for a race war, and that people should be ready to have a shooting war on the streets of our city in defense of the president, and in this case specifically, the voter fraud that he's claiming will happen. And so it's really critical to, I think, understand how emboldened these extremists are in this moment, and how the defendants, as we've described, really are at the center of this violent movement, with platforms and networks online that have impacts that extend well beyond the violence they caused in Charlottesville 3 years ago.
So in other words, the current political climate is not necessarily helping with this type of, rogue terrorism, in other words. It seems as if there's been some abetting and some fueling, and
to put it lightly.
I mean, just to piggyback on that, I mean, that's absolutely true. And I think in two very distinct ways. One is that, I don't need to remind anybody about very fine people on both sides. But I would just note, as may be obvious, I mean, as you might imagine, that particular comment was incredibly traumatic and damaging to people in Charlottesville, among other places, who actually were victimized by white supremacists that day. But secondly, the idea that the sort of false equivalency that's been created and fostered between white supremacists and Antifa, it's not just false, it's incredibly damaging by giving white supremacists exactly the cover that they're looking for. That is to say, we're not violent, we're just defending ourselves against the violence that comes from the left. And that is, it's statistically false. It's false on so many levels, but it's particularly damaging because it's exactly the cover that they sought to create in Charlottesville, and then the cover that they're looking for generally to continue to spread hate and violence.
There are a couple of questions, a few actually, that have started to come in from those who are watching with us that I want to direct to you. One, just prior to that, with all the national partners, Black Lives Matter, congregations, We have synagogues, we have folks across the faith lines, multi-faith communities who are committed to partnership with these types of initiatives that we believe, at least from my faith, it tells us it's a part of our faith, right? To do the work of justice, love, mercy, right? And this is a part of our distinct call. What would you say to us? How can we be helpful, and what is our role in your mind about? So what could our role look like in aiding and helping in this very specific scenario?
Well, there's so much that people can do. And I think that this is an issue of both specifically what happened in Charlottesville in our case and the broader issue of violent extremism that tends to come and go with the very fast moving news cycles these days. We're living in a time where at the drop of a tweet from the president, the entire news cycle can change. And it's so critical that we not let this issue fall by the wayside and fall off the radar at a time when it is dire. And it's not just, you don't have to just take it from us. The experts are saying that white supremacist terror is the, quote, most persistent and lethal threat to the United States. That's a direct quote from the Department of Homeland Security report that came out just last week. The FBI has said the same thing. The stats back it up. We know in 2019, domestic terror levels were higher than they've ever been since 1995, which is the year of Oklahoma City. ADL says that anti-Semitism hit record levels in 2019, that right-wing extremism has hit record levels over 2018 and 2019. So we are dealing with very significant and dire threats here. These are not just anecdotal stories that we're telling. The numbers back up the fact that this is dire. And you wouldn't necessarily know that from the news coverage it gets or from what you hear out of the White House. And so a few things that people can do. First and foremost, if you are inspired by this case, and I do believe that this provides a very concrete and tangible way to do something at a time when, again, it can feel so frustrating and scary. This is a very concrete way to fight back. So if you're inspired by this case, you can get involved through Integrity First for America. We will send out these links after the event, but sign up for case updates, spread the word to your friends and family and colleagues. You could share the video that we showed at the beginning of the program. You can share actually a recording of this very program that will go out in the email tomorrow. And if you have the ability, donate. Every single dollar we raise directly supports this case and crucial security and evidence collection costs. It all directly covers the litigation. Everything that IFA is doing right now is in support of this case and ensuring that our team has the resources they need to win at trial. So get involved with IFA first and foremost, support the case, donate, spread the word, whatever you can do. But more broadly, don't let this issue fall off the radar screen. Hold your elected officials to account, not just on the federal level, but on the state and local level. In Massachusetts, I know there are many who are actually focused on this in ways that perhaps around the country, less so. But we need to keep ringing the alarm bells on this. This is something that elected officials at the private sector and social media companies, we've talked a bit about the role of social media and what happened in Charlottesville, and suffice it to say that social media has been crucial to so many of the subsequent attacks as well. Holding our officials to account, the private sector and social media companies to account, and not letting this fall off the radar screen is just so critical. Don't let another sort of tweet from the president or the news cycle passing you by undermine the importance of this issue.
Well, thank you. Obviously, whenever folks decide to do any of this kind of work, your life and your work can be threatened. How are you all handling those kinds of things right now? And is that something that is a concern that you all are having to manage in the process right now?
When this question comes up, I always check to see if my mother's watching, because this is not her favorite part of my job. I think she's a very enthusiastic supporter of this work, but perhaps not of this specific piece. And I suspect Mike's and the rest of our team's families feel the same way. The threats are real. It is not an accident that both the defendants and their supporters have made threats and harassment central to how they operate. And it's why, to be completely frank, security is the biggest line item in IFA's budget. It's both direct threats from the defendants themselves. So for example, one of our defendants, Chris Cantwell, threatened our attorney, Robbie Kaplan, last summer about all the fun he was going to have with her with much more anti-Semitic and misogynistic language woven in. He was actually just found guilty the other week of threats and extortion against a fellow white supremacist on the same platform he threatened Robbie on just 2 days later. And so we know that these defendants have very real capacities for violence. We saw it in Charlottesville. We've seen it since. Perhaps what's even more concerning is their ability to rile their loyal followers in social media into action. And we also see that firsthand, whether it's threats against IFA or our legal team or our plaintiffs, some of which have resulted in law enforcement taking action. But many of them are very good at walking a line, ensuring that they might not be explicitly crossing the line into threats that are actionable, but that lead to extensive harassment and might inspire someone to real world action. And so again, it really makes our work at IFA all the more important in terms of ensuring security funding is there, because we are not going to let these extremists succeed in doing what they want to do with these threats, which is to dissuade us from holding them accountable, to scare us away from holding them to account for the violence that they cause. And so we are committed to ensuring our team has every resource they need, and that includes, and perhaps most importantly, is security.
I also think it's important along those lines to shout out our clients who not only deal with that as we do, the sort of ongoing chatter, for lack of a better word, but who actually faced down that violence on August 11th and 12th. And they were there that weekend to do that. They were there that weekend knowing that white supremacists were descending on Charlottesville, and they were going to go there and peacefully protest, understanding that there's a risk when you do that. And notwithstanding everything that they experienced on August 11th and 12th, they nonetheless agreed to participate in this lawsuit, which carries everything that Amy has described with it, but they've also sat and been deposed by attorneys for white supremacists who harmed them, and some of whom, the lawyers, share the ideologies of their clients. And so I think we're all, Amy feels the same way. We're just sort of constantly just in admiration of our clients who had the bravery to show up that weekend and to continue with this case.
Are there prior cases where the plaintiffs have prevailed under the KKK Act? That's a really great question. In similar circumstances, or will this be considered a landmark case?
So there are prior cases. It was used effectively in the 60s on behalf of some of the freedom riders who had experienced violence, and it was used in the 20s. There are some cases in history where the KKK Act explicitly was used, including against the Klan in the early 80s, a case brought by Morris Dees and the SPLC to bankrupt the main Klan group back in the 1980s. So there are definitely prior instances of the KKK Act being used effectively against white supremacists. I think this case has the potential to be a landmark case in a number of ways. One of which touches on what we talked about earlier, and that is that there really has been a kind of resurgence of kind of bold and public white supremacy in the last few years. And I think Charlottesville was really kind of a high water mark for that, although unfortunately not the last we saw of it. And so I think to expose what actually happened at Charlottesville and what the goals and objectives of white supremacists actually are, in a public trial where hopefully they are held to account by a jury of their peers, I think in and of itself can send an important message in 2021 that, you know, what they did is not something that we'll tolerate in an American community.
I think our time is starting to run short, so I don't know if I can ask one more question. Do I have time for one more question,
Yeah.
Amy?
I think so.
So I've seen a couple of questions that are related to SPLC and sort of them pioneering this kind of approach. Would either of you talk about that in terms of their engagement with this and sort of their partnership, and or what kind of models they've set for you all to that's framed your understanding of how to approach this?
Absolutely. I think there are a number of organizations that frequently come up in questions during these events, SPLC and ADL being two of the big ones. Both are organizations we work with. The ADL is actually a formal partner of ours. They are a sponsor of tonight's program. They've invested in the case. We are incredibly grateful in the fact that the ADL has invested. I think sends a strong message about the importance of this as a tool in fighting back against hate. SPLC is also an organization we work closely with, much like the ADL Center on Extremism. SPLC's Hate Watch Project does extraordinary research on the white nationalist and white supremacist movement and has reported frequently on our defendants. And so we work closely with researchers and journalists there. You know, they have some of their own litigation that they've done in recent years, but have not taken on a large scale case like ours or like some of the ones they've done in the past, but they have done some extraordinary litigation, including actually against one of our defendants, Andrew Anglin, who is the neo-Nazi who called for a race war the other week that I mentioned. But what all of that is to say, our case uniquely takes on the broad leadership of this movement in a way that no other litigation, no other legal action does right now. And the fact that the leaders of sort of these entities that have been at the forefront of combating hate have been supportive of this effort is both heartening and underscores the urgency of it and the unique role this suit plays among the much broader fight against white supremacy and hate in this country. Oop, I think you're muted.
Do we still have a bit more time to take a few more questions?
We might need to wrap things up. I see Nancy.
All right, Nancy.
It might be that time, but I know that us at if folks have additional questions we didn't get to tonight, they're welcome to send them to us at IFA. We would love to keep engaging with folks, and hopefully this is just the start of our partnership with the Boston community on this.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeremy, both Jeremys, and Amy and Michael. The only frustrating thing is I can't see you all, and I know that there are many of my dear friends, colleagues, and even some family I noticed on the chat who are on the call. So hello and welcome, and you know, hopefully next year in Boston. You know, I want to just highlight and amplify what Amy and Michael are talking about, and Jeremy, what you pointed out. I think, you know, all of us sitting here, however we're sitting, know that we are living in frightening times. Not only the pandemic, not only the hateful rhetoric, not only the many ways in which we're seeing people at risk economically and in terms of health. So it's with particular pride that I sit on the Leadership Council for Integrity First for America. And I do so because in the midst of all the horror, I think we have to have some hope. And those of you who know me know that I am basically an optimist. And I think what Integrity First for America, and a few people ask questions, it really was created out of Robbie Kaplan's amazing brain for this moment. This isn't an organization, and hopefully wouldn't perpetuate itself as an organization, but it was created as and has provided a tangible way for each of us to take action against violent white supremacy. And I think we all know that this is a time, as Jeremy Burton said at the beginning of this, when our democracy is being challenged to its core. Nothing shows this more graphically than the events in Charlottesville, but we know that it's not only the events in Charlottesville. And, you know, whether it's Tree of Life, whether it's Poway, whether all the different incidents that have happened over the last few years, and most recently, the plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan. I mean, outrageous. And we know that there are overlaps in terms of the people behind that. So this isn't just one lone actor. This is definitely a campaign. I think, so all of this has affirmed the critical work of IFA and how they're trying to hold accountable and bankrupt, basically, literally bankrupt the leaders and the hate groups at the center of this violence. And Mike, as Amy and Michael described, the case is already having a major impact on these extremist leaders. Some have already gone to jail, and that's even before the trial. So, and I want to underline incredible that their clients are unbelievable sheroes and heroes in this case. So I hope you'll join me, each and every one of you, in supporting IFA in the ways Amy described, by spreading the word, sharing the video, letting people know that there is something we can do, certainly donating, and, you know, God knows, as Amy said, they're the single largest item in their budget, and it's a very lean organization, let me tell you, with a lean board, and we're all working for the same thing, but it's all about the case. It's every dollar that IFA raises goes directly to support this case. That's all it is. There's not a big infrastructure. There's not a big overhead. This is to get this case and get it done. We were hoping it was going to happen in October, but it's been delayed till April. But this could really, really set back the white extremist movement that is a growing movement. And all of us who suffered and have families who suffered and loved ones who suffered through the Holocaust, you know, it resonates. And I know many of my survivor friends are very frightened by the white nationalism that we're seeing. So we thank you, thank Amy, thank Michael, Jeremy, and thank all of you in Boston and all the participating organizations who co-sponsored this tonight. Thank you for listening, and make sure you circulate and share this story, because we really want to spread the word. And again, hopefully next year in Boston, we will come for a victory party. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, guys.